Welcome to the Jobs and Work podcast. If you're like most Americans, you spend a significant amount of your time working. In fact, we spend more time at our jobs than anywhere else. But how often do we really talk about work in America? On this podcast, the Work for Change team will. Work for Change, LLC is a team of social scientists, thought leaders, and digital storytellers who dig into the critical issues affecting American workers and workplaces today. Our podcast is co-hosted by Dr. Kendra Jason and myself, Dr. Kris Maycumber. We'll also bring guests onto the show who reflect the diversity of the American workforce. We are so excited for you to join us as we lead the efforts to humanize the workplace by building dignity and equity into jobs, work, and organizations. Please subscribe to the podcast and share us with your friends and family. You can learn more about Work for Change at workforchangellc.com. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Jobs and Work podcast, where we talk about everything related to jobs and work today. This is episode number 18. I'm your co-host, Kris Maycumber, and we are going to be talking about in the news today.
And I'm co-host Kendra Jason. And before we jump into the news, Kris and I just want to take a moment to say thank you to all of our dedicated fans who tune in every week and listen to us and support us and give us comments. We value your feedback and we appreciate you following us and supporting us. We also want to say, if you have any ideas for us as far as topics, even if you want to be on our show, please just let us know. Just drop us a line in the comments or go to our website at www.work4changellc.com. Hit contact us and we can start a conversation from there. So in the news today, we're going to talk about a survey that recently came out of Canada, which found that there are some bosses who are actually using the COVID-19 pandemic against their workers. And what we mean by that is that they are guilt tripping, bullying, and harassing their workers into working harder and longer, with the idea that those workers should just be grateful for work, right? And so it's basically, so many people have lost their jobs, so many people have been unemployed. The nature of work has changed dramatically across the world. And in these cases, Kris and I often talk about on this podcast how managers and bosses can do things better in response to COVID-19, such as flexible work arrangements, trying to understand their workers' needs and things of that nature, meeting workers where they are so that everybody can benefit from the working relationship. But today it's a little bit different. Today it's more so really, being specific about employers who are abusing the situation and using the situation against their workers.
Yeah, and something that the article had talked about is how what COVID has really done is shifted power dynamics now, where there always is a power imbalance between employer, employee, boss, workers. But now there's like this sort of heightened grounds for that power dynamic to be exploited further. And what the article also found was that women are disproportionately being impacted. So the women who took the survey were more likely to report that they're now doing more work than they were doing, that they're more likely to experience wage cuts, and that the employers were creating this sort of environment, very fear-based environment, right? That if they didn't do this, if they didn't absorb more labor on their shift, then they could lose their job. So there's this sort of like looming threat of unemployment. And because women are more likely to work in, healthcare and more likely to be doing the cleaning tasks required of COVID, you can see how their job descriptions got bigger with having to take on more of that COVID precautions and safeties. So I think, like Kendra just said, we talk about what can employers do to navigate this COVID environment. And as we sort of move away from it, what can we do to rethink the workplace? And I think this is an anecdote of what not to do, which is to exploit this sort of vulnerability that's already there.
Mhm.
And so hopefully, maybe in a later episode, we can bring someone onto the show who is doing it right. And we often do, right? We bring people onto the show who own their own business and talk about being good leaders and good managers and how, they're trying to create a culture where people feel valued at work
Yeah.
happy and content at their jobs.
Yeah, and so the article did not say like what type of jobs
Mhm.
that these workers were in. So I can't say that these workers are mostly in retail or white collar or blue collar jobs. What I can tell you from my experience is that typically workers who are in low wage jobs, entry level jobs, what can be termed bad jobs, which are jobs which are with low pay, no health insurance, or just really precarious. That often those workers are faced with regular threats to their employment and with this whole sentiment of, well, you need to just be glad that you have a job. This even extends to undocumented workers, right? And so it's always that threat of, if I'm not doing what the boss wants me to do in the way that he or she wants me to do it, then they can I'm replaceable, right? These are typically low skilled jobs. And so there is not a strong bond between the employer and the employee. And so there's a culture where workers are taught or socialized to believe that they're replaceable and they're not valuable. And I really would think that, again, even though this article didn't disclose the range of employers that were surveyed or workplaces that were included, I would really think that a lot of this matters in that context. However, I don't want to lend the case that this doesn't happen in upper level jobs either, in top level jobs and in management jobs. And what makes me think about it in this case is that this is where power and privilege comes in as well. Everybody experienced the pandemic, the global pandemic. Everybody was affected by it in different ways. However, there were people who were way more vulnerable than others, right? And there were, on the other side, there were people who had more resources. And with those resources, you have a safety net. And with that safety net, you have a sense of security. And it also lends to privilege. And in that privilege, a part of privilege is not acknowledging or being able to easily deny the experiences of others who don't share your same experience. And so where I'm going with this is that there may be managers and employers who are in privileged positions, who have more safety nets, who have more financial security, more employment security. And so when their workers, they can't relate to the stressors and the additional challenges that many of their workers have that don't have that same safety and security net. And so what Kris was saying earlier is that, the workplace has changed for these workers, especially these women and entry-level workers who are doing a lot of the physical hard work or the hard service work. The stress levels have increased, not just in the workplace, because you have to clean more, you have to social distance, you have to handle irate customers who don't want to follow protocol, but you're also dealing with the care work and the demands at home, and that's again for another podcast. But the thing is that if the employer and manager does not relate to or understand the compounding effects of how the pandemic has affected its most vulnerable workers, adults, then that bullying, that employer may not even realize that they're bullying, that they're being harassing, or that they're being unreasonable because they're essentially blinded by their privilege and their safety nets.
Right. And that makes me think too, Kendra, about the whole workplace dynamic, that it's sort of bifurcated in the sense that, with any kind of hierarchy, like with that privilege comes more privacy at work. People don't really know what you're doing. Like the higher up you go, the less surveillanced you are. And it's almost like two different workplaces and sometimes three, right? If you think about like executive, mid-management, workers, front lines. So part of what I think we can offer as a consultancy is helping open those pathways so that there is better communication. Because we know that ultimately employers want their employees, they don't want turnover. Nobody wants to keep hiring people over and over again. And part of it is creating a workplace culture, not three different ones, but one sort of symbiotic one where people are working together, where the frontline workers who are on the ground doing this work every day that are front facing feel included and don't feel like they can't go to the person 2 levels up to talk to them, right? Where it's this sort of like exchange of communication. And I don't think we see what it sounds like in the jobs. I know one of the sectors feature was manufacturing and showing how a lot of these blue collar skilled jobs are facing a lot of vulnerabilities because the turnover is so high. There's this expectation of gratitude. If you don't like it here, you can go somewhere else. And it's like the higher up in job status we go, you see less of that sentiment of you should just be grateful. When you go really high up, you see the actual, like you expect people to feel grateful to work for that person rather than you should just be grateful that you have a job. And anytime there's economic strain, that motivation of, it just makes me think about that old adage of like people are, sort of scrambling for crumbs, that there's this like scarcity model and that it's fear-based. Right. And I think that employers who might be feeling the economic strain, they're feeling it too. Because, this isn't to say that people haven't had to make cuts. But what the study is reporting is that even in places that haven't made cuts, they're dangling that over employees' heads, using the sort of, looming fear of COVID to keep people, quote, in line, to create more of an impressive, compliant workforce, which can be really dangerous.
Yeah, and this is also not to say that a lot of managers are intentionally doing this. I mean, managers are human with really, really big responsibilities, right? And so, we understand that their responsibility is number one, to keep the business open, to keep the business going, to try to, keep your profits going so that you can pay workers, right? And so, what we're also saying is not that this is often an unintended consequence of action, not that these managers are like bad, evil people, like targeting, their vulnerable, low wage workers. I mean, that could be the case, and that is the case in some workplaces, of course. But I think what the messaging that Kris is really trying to get across is that this actually happens really unintentionally because people are so narrow-sighted on, or focus on what their job is and getting to that end goal of the job, and that in their interpersonal relationships, that communication factor gets lost, right? Or in that communication, things come across that are not intended. People are being offended or being offensive without even acknowledging their motivation or their intent. And so there's a lot going on in the workplace because the entire workplace is under strain and stress because the entire economy and society is under strain and stress because of the changes of due to COVID-19. And we often talk about, again, how this can be done better or how this can be done well, and that there is a definite change in the workforce and the social organization of work. But we just want managers, especially because you have such a direct and influential role on the daily experiences of your workers, to be mindful of how your interactions and your communications matter and can add to stress and add to a sense of threat to individuals and groups of workers. And so that's why, again, we recommend you bring in a consultancy, you bring in an outside eye, like Work for Change, to see and help you understand your workers, understand if there's a disconnect so we can help you bridge those disconnects.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is important too for this conversation is the role that unions play. which is to help safeguard and protect against some of this. So the article had found that actually that people who were not in unions were 7 times more likely to say that their employment changed during COVID and 5 times more likely to be unemployed altogether. So 7 times more likely to experience some kind of job shift. And also people who are in unions are less likely to see shifts in wages during COVID. So, did you want to say something about unions? You look excited about that.
I know a lot about unions and Kris is from Rhode Island. She's from up north. And so there's a lot of union activity.
Unions in my family. Yeah.
In the South. And in the South, we have the lowest union rates in the country. North Carolina, South Carolina are about a 3% unionization rate for all employers. And so it just, for me, it just opened up in my head a can of worms about the decline of unions and the effect that has had on the workplace and workers. And so the unions are not dead, and unions are not perfect, but in Canada, I'm not as familiar with the unionization in Canada in comparison to the United States. But, in the United States, there has been a steadily and sharp union decline, which has all kind of effects, not just for workers' rights and protections, but also for workers' pensions, Social Security, and retirement. So it has a long lasting effect because of the decline of unionization. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but when you brought in unions, I was like, United States and unions don't have the best relationship. And so,
Yeah, well, and I think that might be a broader conversation that we start having as a society, because of so much from COVID has impacted people's employment and wages. So, and all of those benefits that you just talked about, I think we have, maybe it's the optimist in me is feeling a renewed focus, because this is the world we're in Work for Change and also on our podcast. But, I think if there is a time where there will be increased focus and a resurgence and at least a push to focus more on getting unions, I think this, we're in a timely moment for that to happen, with so much emphasis on work and workplace culture and workers' rights. I think that's to be seen. We'll have to see what comes out of 20 and 21 in terms of long-term union activity. Perhaps in a future episode, we can have someone who is in a union talk about some of that work as well.
Union history in the United States is very, very complicated. It's probably one of the most complicated facets of the American workforce. And so the interesting thing that you brought up is that, as close as I am to, studying work, nationally American work, there, to my understanding, there is no talk about the resurgence of unions, or unions are still being oppressed and pushed out. Unions are heavily politicized, and again, unions are not perfect, but unlike the conversation for the call for social justice, that call does not extend to the resurgence of unionism in the United States. I'll just say that.
Right. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what conversations they're having. How are they trying to, expand their reach, if they are right now trying to sort of capitalize on this moment. Kendra doesn't seem optimistic about that charge. So something else that we wanted to also talk about is, I think, the importance of not only workplace communication and that story that I think certainly came out of this, but in trying to create a workplace culture where there is, I think, a sort of open assessment happening, where employers and employees can create a feedback loop, right? So when we talk about workplace culture and we talk about workplace communication, we talk about them as if they're separate things, but they're not. Part of the workplace culture, and I'm not saying we do this, but I'm saying I think when people talk about culture and communication, those are actually connected. To have a good workplace culture, you have to have good communication. You have to be able, and who gets to communicate, I think, is an important part of that. So some of the work that Kendra and I do is to say, how is communication flowing in the organization? Who gets to communicate the messaging? Are people receiving communication the way you think that they are? And is where people are positioned in a company or a workplace, does that make their ability to communicate any less open? So I know we talk about what we do, and I just wanted to spend a moment saying, like, what does that actually mean for the workplace? That when we're thinking about culture and communication, that's what we mean. Not just talking to each other interpersonally, but how is the workplace structured that is either facilitating good communication or maybe hindering it? So I just saw that as a moment to kind of plug what we focus on as consultants.
Yeah, and I think too, going back to, I'm being inspired by the article, it makes me think about how employers can better center and show value to their workers, right, to their employees. Often management, and executive boards are focused on the client and the customer, of course, right? Not only because that's who they get their income from, but that's who they're there to serve. Yeah. Right. And I think that may be one of the motivating factors as to how and why, in this case, so many employees feel that they're being treated poorly, is because there's so much of a focus on the output, the delivery, and how much income, how much profits that company can still make, that the middle person, the employees, the workers who are delivering the service, who are producing the product, get lost in the mix. And a part of them getting lost in the mix of trying to keep everything going is that their sense of value decreases because, management is thinking about staying open, and management is thinking about how can we best meet the needs of our customers and clients, but they're not necessarily putting as much focus on that central core piece, is that, our workers are the ones who deliver this, right? And so again, but this also feeds into, like Kris was saying, this loop, it also feeds into this idea of the low wage worker and the replaceable worker. And as long as people are, can be easily replaced, or feel that they're easily replaced, or management sees them as easily replaceable, not valuing them for the human and the contributors that they are, you're going to have this dynamic where people feel people are easily threatened and feel that they are devalued by management in that way. And that often shows up in how they are paid or not paid. The article also talks about how, especially with COVID-19, a lot of promises have been dropped or unfulfilled about people being paid a certain rate, getting paid at all. And this is not just undocumented workers, right? These are workers in the workforce. And so there's a lot that goes into it as well. Yeah. So we look forward to seeing you back here next week. Also know that we have our Starting Your Own Business workshop. It's June 19th and 26th. That's the next upcoming one. But again, we're looking forward to seeing you with our small business owner next week. So please like, subscribe, and share. You can find us at www.work4changellc.com. We're on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. So please, again, like, subscribe, and share so we can work to make the world of work better.